Hello everyone. Welcome to Scary Chronicles. I know you've come here to relax and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I thought it would be fun if you let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, get cozy, let your worries fade, and let's begin. Story number 1. I never liked camping. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was peer pressure, or maybe I just didn't want to seem like the odd one out. It was supposed to be harmless fun, a weekend in the woods, just me and 4 of my closest friends, Ryan, Gabe, Lisa, and Chloe. We had packed up our tents, snacks, and enough firewood to last us 3 days. It felt like the kind of adventure you'd look back on and laugh about years later. The hike to the campsite was longer than I expected. The forest was dense, the kind of place where the canopy swallows the sunlight, leaving everything beneath in a perpetual twilight. The air smelled like damp moss and rotting wood. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt oppressive, like the trees were leaning in, listening. As we trudged along, something nagged at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd passed the same tree before. Its trunk was split low to the ground, forming a jagged Y-shape. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the Y tree was there again. It felt like it was following us, though no one else seemed to notice. "Are we almost there?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. My question was met with groans from Ryan and Chloe, but Lisa didn't say anything. She was walking ahead, her pace slower now, her head turning every few steps to glance over her shoulder. When we reached the clearing, I paused. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. The fire pit was already there, a perfect circle of stones that didn't look weathered or old, like someone had just built it. Even the trees around the clearing were too perfect, spaced in an almost mathematical pattern, their trunks leaning slightly inward. "Convenient," Chloe joked, but her laugh sounded forced. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the first ones here, not by a long shot. As we set up the tents, I caught Lisa staring into the woods again. Her hands were trembling slightly as she unfolded her tent. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "Yeah, just... I don't like how quiet it is." Night came fast. Too fast. One moment, the sky was streaked with red and orange. The next, it was black as ink. It wasn't like the sun had set, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. The clearing felt smaller now, the trees pressing in closer than they had before. I glanced at Lisa. She wasn't laughing like the others. Her gaze was fixed on the fire pit, her fingers tracing invisible shapes into the dirt. "Lisa?" I asked quietly. She startled, wiping the dirt with her palm and looking up at me with wide eyes. "You okay?" "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. But when the whistle came again, her head snapped toward the woods. She stared, unblinking, her lips moving slightly, though no sound came out. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart racing. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't look for it." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could press her, Ryan groaned loudly. "Dude, it's just the wind." I wasn't so sure. The whistle wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost like it was calling. "No, seriously," I said. "It sounded like someone whistling." Gabe groaned. "Don't start with that creepy shit. You're just trying to freak us out." But I wasn't. I knew what I'd heard. The others dismissed it, but the sound came again. Louder this time. Clearer. A long, deliberate whistle, like someone calling a dog. It echoed through the trees, too sharp, too human. "Probably just some hiker," Chloe said, but her voice wavered. "Hikers don't whistle like that at night," I whispered. The air felt heavier after that, the laughter and chatter replaced by uneasy silence. We retreated to our tents early, but I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches, made my heart race. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. The whistle. This time, it was closer. The fire had died down to glowing embers, barely enough to light the clearing. The whistle came again, clearer now. It echoed through the trees, too sharp, too human. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding, and unzipped the flap. The forest was still, but something was wrong. I noticed it first in the way the clearing felt different. The trees seemed closer than they had been earlier, their gnarled branches twisting toward the tents like skeletal hands. The fire pit looked untouched, the stones unervingly clean, like no fire had burned there at all. I stumbled out, clutching my flashlight. "Ryan, Gabe." My voice sounded hollow in the silence. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare, human footprints, pressed into the dirt. They led from the edge of the clearing straight to the tents, stopping right outside mine. A twig snapped behind me. "Lisa," I whispered, turning slowly. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Her face was pale, her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but she said nothing. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's already too late," she said softly, almost to herself. "It always is." "What?" I stepped toward her, but she turned and disappeared into the shadows. I froze, my breath hitching. That's when I heard the breathing. Slow, deliberate, and just behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but I stayed frozen, paralyzed by the sound of that breathing. It was close, too close, wet and uneven, like whoever it was had been running for miles. The back of my neck prickled, and I swore I could feel the faint warmth of their exhale against my skin. "You've felt it before, haven't you? That crawling sensation, the one that tells you something's wrong before your brain can catch up. Like when you're walking home alone at night and you feel the weight of eyes on you, hidden in the shadows. You tell yourself it's nothing, just your imagination, but deep down, you know better. That's what this was. Only worse. Because this wasn't my imagination. This was real. I clenched the flashlight tighter, fingers slick with sweat. My voice felt like it had been stolen from my throat, locked away by the growing dread that whatever was behind me wasn't right. The breathing stopped. Just like that. No shuffle of feet, no retreat into the trees. It just ended like whoever or whatever was there had vanished into thin air. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking as I staggered toward Ryan's tent. My flashlight beam wavered across the clearing, catching the faint glint of something wet on the ground. For a moment, I thought it was dew, but when I crouched down to look closer, I realized it wasn't water. It was blood. The footprints, they were smeared now, trailing crimson streaks back toward the woods. But what stopped me cold wasn't the blood or the tracks. It was the fact that there were more of them now. Not one set of footprints. 3. Bare, misshapen prints that twisted and dragged, like whoever made them wasn't walking on normal feet. I scrambled to Ryan's tent, tearing the zipper open. "Ryan!" I hissed. My flashlight flickered over an empty sleeping bag, crumpled and cold. No sign of him. No sign of Gabe, or Lisa, or Chloe. I stood there, swallowing the lump in my throat as the silence pressed in, thicker than the darkness itself. That's when I noticed it. My breath hanging in the air, misting in the sudden chill. The temperature had dropped, but it wasn't just cold. It was wrong. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you don't belong here. Like you shouldn't have come. The whistle came again, louder this time, impossibly close. It was no longer human. It sounded jagged, broken, as if something was mimicking the sound without understanding how it should work. It echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trees until it felt like it was coming from every direction at once. And then I saw it. The trees at the edge of the clearing were swaying, not with the wind, but with something moving between them. A shadow too large, too tall, stretching unnaturally in the faint light of the dying fire. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet with its strings tangled, but its pace was deliberate. Intentional. It stopped just beyond the firelight, and for a moment I thought it was gone. Until I saw the eyes. They weren't eyes, not really. Just two faint pinpricks of light, like reflections in the back of a predator's gaze. But they didn't blink. They didn't waver. They just stared, unblinking, locked on me. You know that feeling when you're in a nightmare, and you know you're dreaming, but no matter how hard you try, you can't wake up? That's what this was. A waking nightmare, one I couldn't escape. The whistle came again, long and slow, and this time it felt like an invitation. Or a warning. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching told me enough. It was following me. Every nerve in my body screamed to keep running, but the forest seemed endless, the trees twisting around me like the ribs of some massive, dying beast. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and the beam flickered with every frantic step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out when I tripped, sprawling face first into the dirt. The flashlight skittered out of my hand, the bulb finally giving up with a soft pop. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, too terrified to move. Then I heard it again. The whistle. But it wasn't behind me anymore. It was to my left. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The forest didn't answer. Of course it didn't. It just loomed around me, silent and suffocating. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I searched for anything I could use as a weapon. A rock, a branch, anything. That's when I heard the voice. "Nick, is that you?" It was Lisa. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't see her, but her voice was unmistakable, echoing softly through the trees. Relief and confusion warred in my chest. "Lisa, where are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. A moment later, she emerged from the shadows, her face pale in the moonlight. She was wearing her jacket, but it was torn, and her hair was matted with dirt and leaves. She looked wrong. Her smile was there, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice soft, almost too calm given the circumstances. "You ran off, and I was worried. I ran off." I snapped, my fear making me bolder than I felt. Everyone was gone. What happened? Where's Ryan? Gabe? Chloe? Her smile faltered, just for a second. "I don't know. We got separated, but we need to go. It's not safe here." "No kidding," I muttered, glancing nervously over my shoulder. "There's something out here, Lisa. Something—" "I know," she interrupted, her tone sharper than I expected. "I saw it too. That's why we need to move." Her urgency was convincing, but something about her felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way she avoided my gaze, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides, it didn't sit right. Still, what choice did I have? I wasn't going to survive out here alone. "Fine," I said, "but we need to find the others." She hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "Of course. Come on. I think I know a way out." She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me through the trees. She moved quickly, like she knew exactly where she was going, but her path didn't make sense. It was winding, looping, as if she was leading me in circles. The whistle came again, distant now, but still too close for comfort. "How do you know where we're going?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I don't," she said quickly, too quickly. I think there's a road this way." "But we didn't come from this direction," I pointed out. She stopped abruptly, spinning to face me. Her expression was strange, equal parts frustration and fear. "Do you trust me or not?" she demanded, her voice low and urgent. I didn't. Not entirely. But before I could respond, a guttural growl cut through the air, closer than ever. I didn't have time to argue. We ran, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the forest behind us. We reached a small clearing, and Lisa pulled me toward a cluster of rocks. "Hide here," she hissed, pushing me down behind one of the larger boulders. "Stay quiet." "What about you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I'll distract it," she said, her expression unreadable. Just stay here, okay? And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows before I could stop her. I crouched behind the rock, every nerve on edge as the growling grew louder. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence in the dark, watching, waiting. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Lisa's voice. But it wasn't calling out to me. It was whistling, long and slow, the same broken tune that had been haunting us all night. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in the dark, but I finally worked up the courage to peek out from behind the rock. The forest was empty. Quiet. Too quiet. And then I saw her. Lisa, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy, but her lips were curved into that same unsettling smile. "Come on, Nick," she said, her voice soft, almost sing-song. "It's safe now." But it wasn't her voice. Not really. It was too flat, too hollow, like someone wearing her skin had learned to mimic her words. And behind her, just barely visible in the shadows, were the eyes. Two pinpricks of light, glowing faintly as they watched me. I didn't wait. I bolted. I ran until my legs felt like they'd snap, until my breath came in jagged gasps that tore at my throat. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running away from anything. I was being herded. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the roots clawing at my feet like hands trying to drag me down. And Lisa's whistle. God, that whistle. It never stopped. Long, slow, and deliberate, like it was winding through the forest itself, carried on a wind that didn't touch my skin. Sometimes it was close, so close I thought she was right behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Other times it was distant, echoing like it came from every direction at once. When I burst through the trees, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just any clearing, it was the clearing. The same one we'd set up camp in. The fire pit was smoldering faintly again, the stones arranged in their perfect, unnatural circle. The tents were back, their flaps closed as if no one had touched them. I staggered forward, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered. "This can't be." A chill ran down my spine when I noticed the tree just beyond the clearing. The Y tree. Its jagged trunk loomed like a marker, its presence mocking me. I'd been here before. I'd never left. The tents were back. All of them. Perfectly pitched, the way they'd been before we went to sleep. My stomach twisted. I knew they hadn't been here when I left. I'd seen the empty space. But now they stood there like nothing had happened, the flaps closed, their shapes too still in the faint light. "Nick," a voice called softly, and my blood turned to ice. It was Ryan. His voice was weak, hoarse, coming from one of the tents. "Nick, help me." My instinct screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Ryan," I croaked. Where have you been?" No answer. Just the soft, rhythmic rustle of fabric, like something shifting inside the tent. "Nick." This time, it wasn't Ryan's voice. It was Gabe's, coming from another tent. Then Lisa's. Then Chloe's. One by one, they called out to me, their voices layered over each other, too smooth, too perfect, like they were reading from the same script. "Nick, help us. Nick, we're hurt. Nick, don't leave us." The flap of Ryan's tent twitched, and something slid out. Not him. Not anything human. It was a hand, or at least it was shaped like one, but the fingers were too long, the skin too pale, almost translucent. It gripped the edge of the fabric, and then another hand joined it, pulling the flap wider. I stepped back, my chest tightening as a shape began to emerge. It was Ryan, or something trying to be Ryan. His face was wrong, stretched and gaunt, his eyes black pits that seemed to eat the light. His mouth hung open, wider than it should, his jaw creaking like wood under strain. "Nick," it rasped, its voice still carrying that echo of his, but layered with something else. Something deeper, hungrier. The tent beside his moved, then the next and the next. More of them were coming out, each one twisted, misshapen, their forms shifting like shadows trying to hold shape. And behind them, from the dark edges of the clearing, came the sound of Lisa's whistle. Slow. Steady. Closer. I stumbled back, tripping over the fire pit, and hit the ground hard. My head spun, and for a second, all I could see was the sky above, the stars faint and distant, winking through the gaps in the canopy. And then something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and froze. There was something standing at the edge of the clearing, taller than the trees, its body impossibly thin, a silhouette that didn't belong in this world. Its head was wrong, too narrow, too elongated, and its arms hung like lifeless branches. But its face, oh God, its face. It didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless plane that seemed to ripple and shimmer like water in the moonlight. But I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, in a voice that wasn't Lisa's, but somehow still was, it spoke. You shouldn't have come here. The words didn't echo. They didn't even sound like they were spoken aloud. They just were, filling the space around me, inside me, until they became my own thoughts. The creature stepped forward, and the ground seemed to bend beneath it, the earth rippling like a reflection in disturbed water. The things that had crawled out of the tents froze, their heads snapping toward it as if waiting for a command. Run, the voice whispered again, but this time it sounded amused, mocking. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted into the forest, the sound of my own ragged breathing barely drowning out the rustle of something massive moving behind me. But as I ran, I realized something horrible. The trees weren't where they were supposed to be. They shifted, their trunks sliding in and out of place, the path twisting and looping back on itself like a labyrinth with no way out. Every step felt heavier, slower, like the ground itself was trying to pull me down. And then I heard it, Lisa's whistle. But this time, it wasn't ahead of me. It was inside my head. It came with words now, her voice weaving through my thoughts like a spider spinning a web. You can't run, Nick. You never could. And as the whistle grew louder, I realized something I hadn't before, something that sent a cold wave of dread crashing over me. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to keep me. I kept running, but it didn't matter. The forest wasn't a forest anymore. It was alive, shifting and twisting, trapping me in its grasp. My legs felt heavier with every step, as though the ground was pulling me down, and my lungs burned like fire. Every direction I turned led back to the same place. Darkness. No clearing, no road, no way out. The whistle was constant now, burrowing into my skull. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, something alive, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a parasite. Every step I took, every ragged breath I drew, it was there, mocking me, guiding me. You shouldn't have come here. Lisa's voice echoed in my mind, but it wasn't just her anymore. It was Ryan's, Gabe's, Chloe's. All of them, blending together into something that wasn't human. Their voices overlapped, weaving into a symphony of whispers that drowned out even my thoughts. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. I stumbled to a stop, collapsing against a tree. My legs couldn't carry me anymore. My body was spent. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching longer, darker, until they swallowed everything. I looked up, desperate for the sky, for the stars, something, anything to remind me I was still in the real world. But the sky was gone. Above me, there was only blackness. Not the darkness of night, but something deeper, something void, something alive. And in that void, I saw them, those pinpricks of light, too many to count, scattered like stars but wrong. Too sharp, too aware. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was raw, my voice stolen by the same force that had taken everything else. That's when I saw Lisa again. She stepped out from the trees, her movements smooth, deliberate. Her clothes were still torn, her hair still matted with dirt, but her face was different. There was no fear there now, no urgency, just a calm, unsettling stillness. Her eyes empty pools of black that reflected nothing. "You're tired," she said softly, her voice echoing in my mind even though her lips barely moved. "I told you not to run." I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me down like quicksand. I clawed at the dirt, but my hands sank deeper with every movement, as though the earth itself had turned against me. "Stop fighting," Lisa whispered. She crouched in front of me, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "It's easier if you don't fight." "Why?" My voice cracked, barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Her smile widened, stretching her face in a way that wasn't human. "Because you came here," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "Because you heard the whistle." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know. None of you ever do." Her voice was almost gentle now, like a mother comforting a child. "But it doesn't matter. You heard it, and now you belong to it." "What is it?" I whispered. Her eyes flicked toward the darkness behind her, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It stepped out of the void, its form shifting, unraveling and reforming with every step. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs too long and angular, its face, if it even had one, smooth and blank. But the worst part was the way it moved. It didn't walk or glide, it folded into existence, like the space around it was bending to its will. "You're part of it now," Lisa said, her voice fading as the thing approached. "We all are." I tried to scream again, but my voice was gone. My mind was unraveling, the whispers growing louder until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. The thing crouched down, its featureless head tilting as if studying me. I could feel it pressing into my thoughts, peeling back my memories, my fears, everything that made me me. And then, finally, I understood. There was no escape. There never had been. This wasn't just a forest. It was a trap, a living, breathing thing that fed on people like me. People foolish enough to stray too far, to hear the whistle, to follow it into the dark. I felt my body sinking deeper into the ground, the cold earth swallowing me whole. Lisa knelt beside me, her hand brushing my arm. Her skin was ice, but her touch felt like it belonged to a stranger. "Don't fight it," she murmured again. "Soon, you'll forget. And then it won't hurt anymore." I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream. But as the darkness closed over me, I realized I didn't have the strength. The last thing I saw was Lisa's face, her hollow smile etched into my mind like a scar. The last thing I heard was the whistle, soft and haunting, fading as the world dissolved around me. And then there was nothing. I jolted awake, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. My hands clutched at the dirt beneath me, solid and real. For a moment, I couldn't move, my mind still trapped in the suffocating nightmare. My heart pounded in my chest, and I frantically looked around. I was in the clearing. The fire was out but still smoldering faintly, a thin line of smoke curling into the starry sky. The tents were exactly where they had been, untouched. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. It was just a dream. Just a terrible, awful dream. I forced myself to sit up, my breath still coming in ragged gasps. But as I did, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My hands were trembling, and beneath the dirt caked on my palms, there was something else. Scratches. Deep, jagged scratches, as if I'd been clawing at the earth. It wasn't entirely a dream. "Nick, you okay?" a voice called softly. I turned to see Ryan emerging from his tent, rubbing his eyes. Behind him, Chloe and Gabe were stirring, their groggy voices breaking the stillness. My words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell them, to scream that something was wrong, that we needed to leave right now. But my mouth felt dry, the words stuck somewhere between my panic and the rational part of my brain that tried to convince me it was just a dream. "What's wrong?" Chloe asked, stepping closer. Her face was etched with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I think we're in danger," I finally managed to choke out. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, shaky and strained. "There's something in these woods. Something watching us." Ryan frowned, his half-awake expression quickly turning skeptical. "You had a bad dream, man. That's all it is. You're freaking yourself out." "No," I snapped, louder than I meant to. The others flinched, and I immediately regretted it, but I couldn't stop. It wasn't just a dream. I heard it. I felt it. There's something out there, and we need to leave. Now. Nick, Gabe said carefully, his voice low, like he was trying not to spook me. It's the middle of the night. We're miles from anywhere. Let's just wait until morning, okay? If you're still freaked out, we'll pack up and go. Morning. The word sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of staying until dawn felt wrong. Like something terrible would happen if we didn't leave now. Please, I whispered, my voice cracking. We can't stay here. Nick, Chloe started, but her voice trailed off. Her gaze shifted past me, into the forest, and her face went pale. What? I asked, turning to follow her eyes. But there was nothing there. Just the trees, dark and impenetrable. I thought I saw, she shook her head, rubbing her arms as if suddenly cold. Never mind. It's probably just a deer or something, Ryan muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to argue, to grab them and drag them out of the clearing if I had to. But before I could, the whistle came. Faint at first, so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the wind. My stomach dropped. What the hell is that? Gabe asked, his face going pale. I told you, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rising pitch of the whistle. It's here. The others exchanged nervous glances, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. Maybe we should go, Chloe said, her voice trembling. Ryan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the whistle grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the trees like it was circling us. The air felt heavier, colder, the oppressive silence closing in again. Grab your stuff, I said, my voice firm now. We're leaving. We scrambled to pack, but something about the air felt wrong, like it was thickening around us, pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I expected to see those pinprick eyes staring back at me. As we moved to leave, I felt a tug of déjà vu, like I'd done this before. Like I'd already tried to run, only to end up back in the clearing. The thought made my head spin, my pulse quicken. What if, I started, but the words stuck in my throat. What if there was no way out? What if we were already trapped? The whistle came again, piercing and sharp, cutting through my thoughts. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind us. Run! I screamed, and we bolted, plunging into the forest. The trees blurred around us, and my heart pounded so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. Not the others, not even my own breathing. But as we ran, the forest seemed to shift, the trees warping and twisting like they were alive. I could feel it, an invisible pull, drawing us back, no matter which direction we went. Then, suddenly, I burst into a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. My blood turned to ice. It was the same clearing. The tents were back, the fire smoldering faintly. And standing there, by the edge of the woods, was Lisa. She turned to look at me, her face calm, her eyes empty, and her lips curling into that same unnatural smile. Nick, she said softly, her voice carrying on the wind. You can't leave. You know that. Behind her, the shadows stirred, and those pinprick eyes blinked into existence, one by one. And that's when I realized I wasn't waking up from this, because I'd never left. Story number 2.
The hum of the computer screen was the only sound in the room, accompanied by the faint rhythmic tapping of Emma's keyboard. The clock on her desk blinked 2:47 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on her mind. Emma was no stranger to late night, rabbit holes on the internet, and the deep web had always held a particular fascination for her. It wasn't the stereotypical horror stories of hackers or illicit dealings that intrigued her. Rather, it was the unexplored corners, the strange forums, cryptic messages, and eerie tales shared by anonymous users. That night, she found herself scrolling through a forum she hadn't visited before. Its plain black background and simple, white text gave it a stark, unsettling feel. One thread caught her eye, its title blinking faintly as if calling out to her, "Your pets know more than you think." A small chill ran down her spine, but curiosity overruled her hesitation. She clicked. Inside, the thread was full of fragmented stories, each more bizarre than the last. The first post described a cat that seemed to predict accidents before they happened, staring intently at its owner just moments before a glass would shatter or a picture frame would fall. Another user claimed their parrot would mimic a voice they didn't recognize, whispering warnings late at night. But the one that struck her the most was a tale of a golden retriever who allegedly whispered its owner's name during a power outage. The owner had described the sound as a low, guttural voice, nothing like the playful barks or whimpers they were used to hearing. Emma leaned back in her chair, scoffing softly. "People will believe anything," she muttered to herself, glancing over at Max, her own golden retriever. He was sprawled across his usual spot at the foot of her bed, snoring softly, blissfully unaware of her late-night obsession. Max had been Emma's companion for 5 years, and she often joked that he was more human than dog. He had a knack for knowing when she was upset, always pressing his head against her leg as if to comfort her. Despite his size, Max was goofy and harmless, more likely to trip over his own paws than intimidate anyone. The idea of him doing something, as eerie as whispering her name, seemed laughable. But as the night wore on, Emma couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Something about the stories in the thread lingered, planting seeds of doubt in her otherwise logical mind. She rationalized it as a mix of sleep deprivation and her overactive imagination, yet her eyes kept drifting back to Max. He looked peaceful, but there was something almost too still about the way he lay there. She shook her head and shut the laptop. "I'm letting this get to me," she said aloud, her voice breaking the silence. Max didn't stir. Normally, the sound of her voice, even softly spoken, was enough to make his ears perk up. But tonight, he remained motionless. That first night, Emma didn't think much of it. She brushed it off and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Yet as she lay there in the dark, her mind kept replaying the strange stories she'd read. What if there was some truth to them? What if animals really could see or sense things that humans couldn't? The thought was unsettling, but she finally managed to drift off. Around 3:30 a.m., Emma woke with a start. She wasn't sure what had roused her at first, but the room felt different, heavier somehow. Her eyes adjusted to the dim glow of her computer screen, still on but idle, and then she saw him. Max, no longer lying at the foot of the bed. He was sitting upright near the doorway, staring into the dark hallway beyond. His posture was rigid, his ears alert. "Max," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge her at all. It was as if he couldn't hear her, or worse, as if he was too focused on something else. A shiver ran down her spine. "Come on, boy, bedtime." She patted the mattress, trying to coax him back, but Max didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the hallway, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a pang of fear. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and used its flashlight to illuminate the hallway. Empty. Nothing but the faint outlines of furniture greeted her. She got up, her heart pounding, and gently touched Max's head. His fur was warm, reassuringly familiar, but his body felt unnaturally tense. "What's wrong?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Max finally turned his head to look at her, his eyes catching the light in a way that made them glint eerily. He let out a low whine and licked her hand, but the tension in his body didn't ease. Emma led him back to his bed and sat beside him for a while, stroking his fur until he finally seemed to relax. But as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Max had never behaved like that before. He wasn't an anxious dog, and he certainly wasn't one to fixate on shadows or empty spaces. The next day, Emma tried to rationalize the event. Maybe he heard a noise outside, she told herself, though her street was notoriously quiet at night. Or perhaps he had sensed her own anxiety and was mirroring it. Yet, deep down, Emma couldn't dismiss the nagging, feeling that there was more to it. She returned to the forum that evening, scrolling through the thread again. This time she noticed a post she hadn't seen before. It was a warning written in red text. "If your pet starts behaving strangely, don't ignore it. They might be trying to protect you." Emma stared at the words, her pulse quickening. Protect her from what? She glanced over at Max, who was once again sitting near the doorway, his ears twitching as if listening to something only he could hear. Over the following nights, Max's behavior grew increasingly unusual. Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Normally a carefree and playful dog, Max had become distant and alert, as though constantly on edge. He no longer greeted her at the door with his wagging tail or brought her his favorite chew toy for their nightly game of fetch. Instead, he would sit near the corners of the house, his eyes fixed on spots that seemed utterly mundane to Emma, but appeared to hold immense significance to him. The hallway became Max's favorite spot, much to Emma's discomfort. Every night, after she turned off the lights and prepared to sleep, Max would position himself just outside her bedroom door, sitting upright and motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse beyond. His once lazy demeanor had been replaced by an unnerving intensity. Emma would call out to him, sometimes with a nervous laugh, but Max rarely responded. He would occasionally flick an ear or glance at her briefly, but it was clear his attention was elsewhere. One particular night, Emma tried to break the routine. "Max, come here, boy," she called, patting the bed like she used to. "No more guarding the hallway. Whatever it is out there, I promise it's just shadows." Max didn't move. He let out a low whine, the kind he made when something genuinely upset him, and turned his head back toward the hallway. Emma's stomach twisted. Her logical mind wanted to dismiss his behavior as a fluke, an overreaction to a small noise, or perhaps a sign of age catching up with him. But her gut told her otherwise. It wasn't just Max's behavior that was strange, it was the palpable tension that seemed to fill the house every time the sun went down. During the day, Max appeared almost normal. He would eat his meals, follow Emma around the house and nap in his usual sunny spots. But as dusk crept in, everything changed. He would become hyper-vigilant, his ears perking up at the slightest creak or distant hum. Emma started to notice the pattern, and it began to weigh on her. "I'm letting the deep web get into my head," Emma muttered one evening, scrolling through the same forum thread that had started her paranoia. The thread had grown longer, with new stories being added almost daily. People shared chilling accounts of their pets, behaving in ways that defied explanation. Cats refusing to enter certain rooms, birds squawking cryptic phrases, and dogs like Max staring at invisible things. One user claimed their dog began scratching at the walls, as if trying to dig through to another dimension. Emma slammed her laptop shut, irritated at herself for indulging in the absurdities. Yet, despite her frustration, she couldn't help but observe Max out of the corner of her eye. He was at the doorway again, his body rigid, his ears twitching. "Max, seriously, what are you looking at?" she asked aloud, her voice tinged with exasperation. She stood up and walked over to him, crouching to meet his gaze. His eyes didn't waver. They were locked on the darkened hallway, as if something were standing there, just out of her sight. A chill ran down Emma's spine. She reached out, placing her hand gently on Max's head. His fur was warm, but his muscles were taut. He didn't flinch at her touch, but let out another low whine, one that seemed almost mournful. It wasn't just the hallway that held Max's attention. Over time, Emma noticed he would fixate on other parts of the house as well. Corners of the living room, the space under the dining table, even the ceiling at times. It was as if he were tracking something invisible that moved freely around the house. These moments were fleeting but unmistakable. Every time they happened, Emma felt the air grow heavier, almost oppressive. In an attempt to reassure herself, Emma began searching for rational explanations. She booked a vet appointment, convinced that Max's strange behavior must have a physical cause. Maybe his hearing or vision was deteriorating, or perhaps he was experiencing some kind of canine anxiety. The vet, however, found nothing wrong. Max was healthy, even thriving for his age. "Maybe he's just getting older and more cautious," the vet suggested. "Dogs can sometimes become more alert as they age, especially if they're bonded to their owner. He might just be protecting you." Emma nodded, grateful for the reassurance, but unconvinced. Max's behavior didn't feel like caution or protectiveness. It felt like fear, and worse, it was starting to infect her. She began double-checking locks, turning on extra lights, and keeping her phone within arm's reach at all times. Her sleep began to suffer. Every night she would lie in bed, staring at the faint outline of Max in the doorway, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. She tried sleeping with the door closed once, hoping to block out whatever had captured Max's attention, but the experiment lasted less than an hour. Max had scratched and whined at the door incessantly until she finally let him back in. "You're driving me crazy, Max," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. "What do you see out there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Max didn't respond, of course, but his body language spoke volumes. His ears twitched, his tail gave a nervous flick, and he let out a low growl. Emma's breath hitched. Max wasn't the kind of dog to growl, ever. It wasn't in his nature. Yet here he was, growling softly at the empty hallway, his hackles slightly raised. Emma reached for her phone, using its flashlight to sweep the area. Nothing, just the same old shadows and furniture. But as she turned the light off, she swore she saw something. A faint movement in the corner of her eye gone before she could focus on it. She froze, her heart pounding, and turned back to Max. He was staring at her now, his eyes wide and filled with what she could only describe as desperation. The next morning, Emma decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. Sitting at the kitchen table with Max by her side, she clasped her hands together and whispered a simple plea for protection and clarity. It felt silly, almost childish, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her world was beginning to unravel. Max rested his head on her lap, letting out a soft sigh. It was the most relaxed he had been in days, but Emma couldn't help wondering, was it her prayer that calmed him, or was it something else entirely? The following evening, Emma resolved to dig deeper into the strange thread on the deep web. Her nerves were frayed, and Max's behavior continued to gnaw at her mind. He remained restless and alert, and his focus on invisible things around the house seemed more deliberate. She couldn't ignore it anymore. There had to be an explanation, or at the very least, a clue. Sitting in her dimly lit room, Emma navigated back to the forum where it had all begun. The thread had grown longer since her last visit, with new posts detailing eerie pet encounters. Some described harmless but odd behaviors, like cats hissing at walls or birds avoiding certain windows. Others were more disturbing, hinting at supernatural forces. Emma scrolled through the posts, her unease growing with each story. Then she saw it, a message that seemed almost directed at her. For those whose pets are acting differently, you need to listen to them. They're trying to protect you. If you want to understand, follow the link below, but be warned, you may not like what you find. The post was signed with a username she hadn't noticed before, Watcher101. Something about it felt too personal, as if the person had written it specifically for her. Against her better judgment, Emma clicked the link, her screen briefly going black before loading a minimalist web page with a single downloadable file labeled Instructions for Speaking to Them. Her heart raced. What was this? Instructions to talk to her dog? It seemed ridiculous, like some kind of elaborate prank. And yet, the thought gnawed at her. What if there was something real to it? What if understanding Max could help her figure out what was going on? After a moment of hesitation, Emma downloaded the file. The document was a simple text file, but its contents were anything but simple. It listed a series of steps, written in an ominously calm tone. Create a quiet, dark space where you and your pet can sit without distractions. Place your hands on their head and focus on their breathing. Repeat the following phrase 3 times. I am here to understand. I am here to see. Wait for their response. Be patient. It may not come immediately. If your pet does not respond, do not attempt again. If they do, listen carefully. Emma stared at the instructions, her fingers trembling slightly. The rational part of her screamed that this was a bad idea. But the irrational part, the part fueled by sleepless nights and Max's unsettling behavior, whispered that she had nothing to lose. She decided to try it. Turning off the lights, she created a quiet space in her living room. She sat cross-legged on the floor, Max lying in front of her. He seemed calm, his golden eyes reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Okay, Max, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's see what this is all about. Placing her hands gently on his head, she closed her eyes and focused on the rhythm of his breathing. It was slow and steady, a soothing contrast to the anxiety bubbling in her chest. Taking a deep breath, Emma began repeating the phrase, "I am here to understand. I am here to see." The words felt strange in her mouth, like they didn't belong to her. She repeated them again, then a third time. The room felt impossibly silent, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Max remained still beneath her hands, and Emma felt a pang of embarrassment. Of course, this was just some ridiculous hoax. What had she expected? But then Max shifted. It was subtle, a twitch of his ears, a slight movement of his head. But it was enough to make Emma's heart leap. She opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. Max was staring at her with an intensity she had never seen before. His golden eyes seemed deeper, almost human, and for a moment Emma could have sworn she saw something, an emotion, a thought, flicker within them. "Max," she whispered. Her voice sounded foreign, shaky, and then it happened. At first, the sound was low, almost imperceptible, like a distant hum. It grew steadily, forming into something resembling a word. Emma froze as she realized the sound was coming from Max. His mouth didn't move, but the noise was unmistakable, a guttural, almost mechanical whisper. Emma. Her name. He had said her name. Emma's blood ran cold. She pulled her hands back instinctively, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Max remained still, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it, but the sound replayed in her mind with perfect clarity. She wanted to run, to leave the room, but something kept her rooted in place. She took a shaky breath and reached out to Max again, her hands trembling. "Max, what's going on?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What are you trying to tell me?" Max didn't respond, at least not immediately. He let out a soft whine, pressing his head against her hand. It was a gesture of comfort, one that Emma had felt countless times before, but now it carried a weight she didn't understand. She stroked his fur absently, her mind racing. What had just happened? How was it possible? Desperate for answers, Emma returned to the forum, her hands shaking as she typed out a new post. "I think my dog just spoke to me. Has this happened to anyone else?" The response was almost immediate. A user named Watcher101 replied, "If he spoke, it means you've been noticed. Be careful, they see you now." Emma stared at the screen, her stomach churning. Who were they? What did this mean? She glanced over at Max, who was now lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He looked peaceful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreversible. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Emma couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the sound of Max's voice over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it again. Emma. It was a warning, she was sure of it. But a warning of what? Emma barely slept after the night Max spoke. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified to an unbearable volume. The weight of his whispered Emma clung to her mind, a word. That felt less like recognition and more like a warning. But from what or from whom? The next day she tried to go about her routine as usual. Coffee, emails, and a half-hearted attempt at designing a client's logo. But everything felt muted, like the world was off-kilter. Max, normally her cheerful shadow, followed her more closely than ever, his golden eyes never leaving her. Whenever she moved between rooms, he'd position himself strategically, as if guarding her from something invisible. "Max," she said softly, crouching to his level. "What are you trying to tell me?" His ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't respond. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her thoughts spiraling. She needed answers, and the only place she could think to look was the forum that had dragged her into this nightmare in the first place. That evening, Emma logged back onto the deep web, her heart pounding as she navigated to the thread. The gaze. Conversation had shifted dramatically. Posts were no longer just accounts of strange pet behaviors. They were warnings. If your pet has spoken, stop. Don't ask questions. Don't engage further. Another user wrote, "They're aware of you now. Once they see you, it's hard to escape." And then there it was, another post from Watcher101. "The first encounter will always be subtle. Do not ignore it. Your pet is the only one who can protect you." Emma's stomach churned. The posts felt personal, directed. She had questions, too, many to ignore. But before she could type a response, a loud thud echoed from the living room. Her heart leapt into her throat. Max, who had been lying by her feet, shot up, ears perked and body tense. "Stay here," she whispered to him, grabbing her phone and hesitantly walking toward the sound. The living room was empty, or so it seemed. Everything was as it should be. The coffee table stacked with magazines, the curtains drawn, and the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light. But something felt off. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Emma's gaze landed on the source of the noise. A book had fallen off the shelf. She approached it cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. The book lay open on the floor, its pages bent at an awkward angle. She reached down to pick it up, and as her fingers brushed the cover, a faint sound, like static, buzzed in her ears. She froze, her heart hammering. The static grew louder, morphing into a low, distorted hum. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through her skull. She stumbled back, her phone slipping from her hand and landing with a dull thud on the carpet. Emma, her name spoken again in that same guttural, mechanical voice. But this time it wasn't Max. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, yet the voice had been so close, as though someone had whispered directly into her ear. Max burst into the room, growling low and deep, his hackles raised. He positioned himself between Emma and the empty space where the sound had come from, his body rigid with tension. "Max," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The static subsided, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Max continued to growl, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room. Emma followed his line of sight but saw nothing. Still, the air in that corner felt wrong. She couldn't describe it, but it was as though the space itself was vibrating, subtly distorted. Emma backed away slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She fumbled to turn on the flashlight, aiming it toward the corner. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating nothing but bare walls and furniture. Yet Max didn't relax. His growls turned into sharp barks, loud and urgent, each one making Emma flinch. "Stop it, Max," she cried, her voice cracking. But he didn't stop. He barked and barked, his body taut with fear and aggression. Finally, he lunged forward, snapping at the empty air. Emma grabbed his collar, pulling him back. "What's wrong with you?" she demanded, though the question felt hollow. She wasn't angry, she was terrified. Whatever Max was reacting to, she knew it wasn't imaginary. She dragged him back to her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. Max panted heavily, his tail tucked between his legs. He climbed onto the bed, pressing himself against her, as though seeking comfort, or offering it. Emma sat there in the dark, clutching her phone and staring at the door. Her thoughts raced, each one more irrational than the last. She knew she couldn't stay in the house much longer. Something had changed, something she couldn't explain. Before she could think further, her phone buzzed in her hand, the sudden vibration making her jump. She glanced at the screen. It was a notification from the forum, a private message from Watcher Hunter 01. "It's only the beginning. Don't let them in." Emma's blood turned cold. She stared at the message, her mind reeling. She wanted to respond, to demand answers, but her fingers felt paralyzed. Max let out a low whimper, nuzzling against her. She wrapped her arms around him, her fear momentarily replaced by a desperate need to protect him. Who or what was trying to get in? As the night stretched on, Emma realized one horrifying truth. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. The first encounter had come and gone, but the real danger was only just beginning. The message from Watcher 101 haunted Emma. "It's only the beginning. Don't let them in." What did it mean? And why did it feel like the user was speaking directly to her? She needed answers. But with every passing hour, the weight of her fear grew heavier. Max's constant vigilance only added to her unease. Whatever was happening, it felt as though her home was no longer her own. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma dove deeper into the thread. The posts had taken on a darker tone, with users sharing warnings instead of stories. Phrases like "they can see you now" and "the veil is thinning" appeared repeatedly, cryptic yet unsettling. Emma searched for Watcher 101's older posts, hoping to find some context. Their contributions to the thread spanned months, detailing an intricate web of warnings and cryptic insights about the connection between pets and the unseen. One post caught Emma's attention. "Pets act as our guardians. They see what we can't, but they can only protect us for so long. If you've noticed changes in your pet, you've already been marked. Stay vigilant and don't trust what you hear." Her stomach churned. Marked? By what? The idea was absurd, yet the events of the past few days made it impossible to dismiss. Her mind raced as she considered the implications. Had her curiosity opened a door she couldn't close? Later that evening, she noticed something strange on her computer. While revisiting the thread, her screen flickered, briefly displaying what appeared to be an IP address before vanishing. Her heart skipped a beat. Was someone tracking her? Paranoia began to creep in. She checked her router settings, scanned for malware, and even considered disconnecting from the internet entirely. But none of her precautions eased the gnawing feeling that she was being watched. Max's behavior confirmed her suspicions. He followed her everywhere, his eyes darting toward unseen corners, his growls more frequent and urgent. Emma's attempts to comfort him felt hollow. The bond they once shared now carried an undercurrent of dread, as though they were both waiting for something to happen. The breaking point came when Emma discovered a new message in her private inbox. It wasn't from Watcher 101 this time. The sender's username was a string of random letters and numbers, and the subject line simply read, "You can't hide." Her hands trembled as she opened the message. The body of the text was brief, but chilling. "Your dog can't save you, they're already inside." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She immediately glanced at Max, who was standing by the door, his posture stiff. His ears twitched, and he let out a sharp bark, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The next morning, Emma felt like a ghost of herself. Her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and her body ached from staying tense all night. Max seemed just as drained, but his loyalty kept him glued to her side, his every move protective and deliberate. She couldn't shake the events of the previous night, the power outage, the voices, and the cryptic warnings. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. Desperate for clarity, Emma returned to the forum, hoping Watcher 101 could provide more insight. The thread had exploded with activity overnight, filled with users reporting similar experiences. Posts described power outages, shadowy figures, and voices mimicking loved ones. One particularly chilling post read, "They're feeding on your fear. The more scared you are, the stronger they become." Emma's heart sank. Was that why they were targeting her? Had her paranoia and sleepless nights made her a beacon for whatever they were? Amidst the noise, Watcher 101 had left another message, pinned to the top of the thread. "They are the Watchers. They exist in the spaces we cannot see but that animals can. Pets are our last line of defense, but once you've been marked, the Watchers grow stronger. The more you acknowledge them, the closer they come." Emma stared at the words, her stomach twisting into knots. She had seen something, felt something, and acknowledged it. Was that why her home now felt like it was teetering on the edge of two realities? Her mind raced back to Max's initial changes, his fixation on shadows, his growls at empty corners. He had been trying to warn her from the beginning. Her thoughts were interrupted by a new notification, another private message from Watcher 101. It read, "If Max starts acting more agitated, you're running out of time. The Watchers can't cross the threshold until you let them. They will try to trick you. Trust Max, he will know the difference." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. Trust Max. He was her only ally in this nightmare, but how much longer could he hold them back? She closed the laptop and turned to Max, who was sitting by the window, his ears twitching. His gaze was fixed on the glass, and Emma followed his. Line of sight. The street outside was eerily quiet, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed it, a figure standing across the street, completely still. It wasn't moving, and the longer Emma stared, the more unnatural it seemed. Its outline was blurred, almost as if it were vibrating at a frequency she couldn't quite perceive. Max let out a low growl, his body tense. Emma stepped back from the window, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture, hoping the lens might capture what her eyes couldn't. When she checked the image, her blood ran cold. The figure wasn't there. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be real," Max barked sharply, breaking her trance. He turned toward the front door, his growls deepening. Emma's chest tightened. Was it here? Whatever the watchers were, they seemed to be getting bolder. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the familiar weight of dread settled over Emma. She turned on every light in the house and sat in the living room with Max at her feet. Her laptop sat open, on the coffee table, but she couldn't bring herself to look at the forum again. Instead, she clutched her phone, its flashlight pointed at the doorway. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. Max's behavior became increasingly erratic. He paced the room, his growls turning into frantic barks. He'd stop suddenly, staring at the walls or ceiling, his tail low and rigid. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to soothe him, but nothing seemed to calm him down. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the quiet house. Max positioned himself between her and the door, barking furiously. His hackles were raised and his teeth bared. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, insistent and deliberate. Emma's phone buzzed, the sudden vibration making her jump. A text appeared on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "Let me in, Emma. It's me." Her heart sank. The message was accompanied by a picture, her sister's face smiling warmly. But Emma knew it wasn't real. Her sister lived 3 states away, and they hadn't spoken in months. The Watchers were trying to trick her, just as Watcher No. 1 had warned. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Emma, please. It's cold out here." The voice sounded like her sister's, but there was an unnatural quality to it, a hollow echo that made Emma's skin crawl. Max barked even louder, his body pressing against her as if to shield her from the unseen presence. Emma clung to him, her knuckles white as she gripped his collar. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't. Come in." The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, all pleading for entry. The lights in the house flickered, and Emma felt a deep, bone-chilling cold seep into the room. She buried her face in Max's fur, tears streaming down her face as she repeated over and over, "You're not real. You're not real." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. The lights stabilized, and the oppressive cold lifted. Emma opened her eyes, her body trembling. Max had stopped barking, but his body remained tense, his gaze fixed on the door. Emma's phone buzzed again. Another message from Watcher 101. "They will try again. Stay strong. Max is your anchor. They fear him more than they fear you. Emma." Let out a shaky breath, clutching Max tightly. Whatever the Watchers were, they weren't giving up. But as long as Max was by her side, she had a chance. She just had to hold on. The following day, Emma felt the weight of exhaustion bearing down on her, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. The events of the previous night confirmed one thing. The Watchers were escalating. Each encounter was growing bolder, more invasive, and Emma's thin barrier of safety was fraying. Max had been her constant shield, but even he seemed weary. His barks, his growls, and his vigilant pacing made it clear that the battle wasn't over. Emma turned to Watcher 101 for guidance, her desperation bleeding into every message she typed. "How do I make this stop? What do they want? Please, I can't keep doing this." She sent the message and stared at her screen, willing a response to come. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Max nudged her hand, his warm nose breaking. Through the fog of her anxiety, she looked down at him, his eyes filled with a quiet determination that steadied her fraying nerves. "It's just us, huh?" she whispered, running her fingers through his fur. "We'll figure this out." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma felt the familiar sense of dread return. She prepared the house as best she could, turning on every light and double-checking the locks. Her phone buzzed with a new message just as she settled onto the couch with Max by her side. It was from Watcher 101. "This is your last chance. If they come again, do not acknowledge them. Don't listen to their voices, don't answer their knocks, and whatever you do, don't open the door. Max will know when they're gone." Emma read the message over and over, her pulse quickening. It was clear now that she was out of time. Whatever had been stalking her through the thin veil between realities would make its final attempt tonight. She had to be ready. Hours passed in tense silence, the hum of the lights the only sound in the house. Emma sat with her back to the wall, Max lying at her feet. His ears twitched occasionally, but otherwise he remained calm. The stillness was suffocating, every creak of the house making Emma jump. Then it began. A single knock echoed through the house, louder than before, reverberating in her chest. Max immediately shot to his feet, his body rigid as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the door, every instinct screaming at her to stay where she was. The knock came again, this time followed by a voice. "Emma, it's me, let me in." It was her mother's voice, warm and familiar. But Emma knew better. Her mother had passed away years ago. The realization sent a cold wave of fear washing over her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, gripping Max's fur for comfort. His growls grew louder, his body positioned protectively in front of her. The voice persisted, growing more desperate. "Emma, please. I need to talk to you. Open the door." It was uncanny how perfectly it mimicked her mother's tone, her cadence. But there was something hollow about it, an emptiness that made Emma's skin crawl. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. She wouldn't respond. She couldn't. The knocks turned into pounding, and the voice became a chorus, overlapping whispers and shouts that filled the room. "Emma, let us in. We can help you." The lights began to flicker, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma wrapped her arms around Max, tears streaming down her face as the cacophony grew unbearable. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for her. "Focus," she whispered through clenched teeth. "It's not real. They can't get in." Max barked furiously, snapping at the shadows, his movements frantic but purposeful. His presence was the only thing keeping Emma grounded, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She held onto him tightly, refusing to let the fear consume her. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Emma's ragged breathing and Max's panting. The light stabilized, and the oppressive cold lifted. Emma opened her eyes cautiously, her body trembling. The house was still, the shadows motionless. Max turned to her, his tail wagging slightly, and let out a soft whine. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed again and she hesitated before picking it up. The screen displayed one final message from Watcher 101. "They're gone for now, but they'll always be watching. You survived because you trusted Max. Never forget, your dog is your shield, and as long as he's with you, you'll be safe. But remember, curiosity is what brought them to you. Don't go looking for answers again. You won't like what you find." Emma stared at the message, the weight of its warning sinking in. She looked at Max, who was now lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He looked exhausted but content, as though his job was done, for now. The events of the night had left Emma shaken, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never revisit that thread, never explore the dark corners of the internet that had brought this nightmare into her life. Her curiosity had nearly cost her everything. As the first rays of sunlight seeped through the windows, Emma finally allowed herself to relax. She leaned down to hug Max, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. Emma knew the Watchers weren't gone forever, but for now, she was safe. And as long as Max was by her side, she would be ready for whatever came next.
Story number 3. As a kid growing up in my neighborhood, everyone knew about Farmer Fred's, partly because it was an abandoned farm in the middle of the Pittsburgh suburbs. but largely due to the fact that it was haunted. A farm in my neighborhood was probably commonplace at the turn of the 19th century, but by the time I was a kid we were surrounded by strip malls, fast food restaurants, and housing developments. That being said, there was and is still a good deal of green space, and at least one farm, albeit no longer operational. According to local legend, Farmer Fred had come from a long line of dairymen who had called our little patch of western Pennsylvania home. He could trace his lineage back to the Quakers, and his small farm in Ross Township, while not profitable, was his pride and joy. As the legend goes, at some point in the 1950s, developers had purchased all of the surrounding farms, leaving Farmer Fred as the only remaining holdout. No one can say for certain how it happened, but one Halloween night, a group of trick-or-treaters stumbled upon the body of Farmer Fred, hanging from a rafter in the entrance to his house, eyes red with blood and an expression of terror on his face. Some say that the farm was going under and that he was going to be forced into bankruptcy. Others say that developers murdered him and staged a suicide in order to get the farm. What everyone can agree on is that Farmer Fred cursed that house and his land, and swore to seek vengeance on anyone who would ever disturb his property. As time went by and the developers attempted to bulldoze the farmhouse, horrible accidents befell the workers. A backhoe and its driver were killed in a rock slide, the road leading to the farm gave way, crippling 2 other construction workers, a sinkhole prevented further construction vehicles from accessing the property, and a random pocket of methane gas caused an explosion that could be felt as far as downtown Pittsburgh, almost 10 miles away. Eventually, the land was deemed unsafe to develop further, and the developers' plan for a mall had to be moved a few miles north. In time, they developed the other properties, building an elementary school and several homes, but no one touched Farmer Fred's property. So there it sat, falling into disrepair, aging more like a man than a house. As a kid, I learned about Farmer Fred through the football team. Our home field was at Ross Elementary, and where we practiced was a literal stone's throw from Farmer Fred's property. The older boys would pass on the legend to the younger ones, and when we got to about 12 or 13 years old, most of us would go through a terrifying rite of passage. After the last practice of the year, our parents would have a cookout at the field. While most of the younger kids were eating and playing games, the rising 8th graders would sneak off to Farmer Fred's. I still remember approaching the house that year, trembling with fear as the sun was beginning to set, casting hues of magenta and rose across the cloudy sky. The breeze picked up, tossing leaves in its wake like hundreds of bees swarming around a hive. The farmhouse sat at the edge of an overgrown field, sprawling over the hillside and tucked against an old-growth forest, many of the trees becoming increasingly threadbare as October rolled into November. You could almost feel the bitter cold of winter closing in, especially on nights like that. The abandoned homestead loomed in the distance, warped and gray from years of neglect, the yellow paint long peeled away, revealing only raw planks, splintered over time, but still holding strong. 2 dark windows on the top floor stared out at us like a pair of hollow eyes, giving a glimpse of the possible terrors that lived inside. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing, allowing for autumn leaves to accumulate inside the walls, blanketing whatever evil may lurk inside. Mounds of ivy and dead vines engulfed the walls, snaking through decrepit pillars and onto the front porch. The front door hung ajar, barely holding onto its hinges, swaying in the breeze, sending a low groan out into the crisp autumn night. Occasionally, the wind would carry the faintest hint of decay, as if the house itself was rotting from the inside out. Tonight was one of those nights, as the air was thick with the weight of something unseen, something unknown, something old, lurking just beneath the surface waiting for us. With Halloween the following night, our group's collective anxiety was palpable. A hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me close, sending a jolt of fear through my body. "What's your game plan?" "I think I am going with a stone," my best friend Jimmy whispered in my ear as we slowly approached the property line. Our rite of passage involved one of 3 options, none of which were an easy task for a middle schooler. The first was to throw a stone through one of the windows of the farmhouse. The rock had to shatter glass, so as years went by, there were fewer and fewer options. It also meant having the arm strength to accomplish the feat from a safe distance. On top of that, it was well known that the Ross police would patrol the elementary school around Halloween, and if they heard a crack of glass, you ran the risk of capture and the inevitable trip to the magistrate that followed. Option number 2 was far less of a risk for trouble, but in my opinion was the most terrifying option. In front of Farmer Fred's house was an old skeletal scarecrow. This figure had already haunted my dreams from the time I first set eyes on it. He stood at least 7 feet tall, his body long and thin, arms outstretched, oddly resembling a crucifixion. His red flannel shirt worn of almost all its color, his denim pants a patchwork of holes and tattered fabric, barely hanging on by a thread. His head resembled a lumpy volleyball in size and shape, covered in an old burlap sack, dark eyes cut menacingly into whatever filled this monstrosity's head. A terrifying crooked grin had been stitched into the sack below the eyes, and he was topped with a flat-brimmed cowboy hat, something you might see Clint Eastwood wearing. Somehow this creature had stood the test of time, through nearly 5 decades of spring rains, summer sun, fall winds, and winter snow. He somehow remained, terrifying generations of youngsters who dared cross his path. Only the bravest rising footballers dared to cut a piece of cloth from his shirt, and from what I'd heard, the last kid that did ended up in a coma. Needless to say, I would not be going near that nightmare creature. The final option, and the route I would likely be taking, was to steal a jack-o'-lantern from a home in the neighborhood and place it on Farmer Fred's front porch as an offering. For this reason, every Halloween you would find a dozen or so glowing jack-o'-lanterns illuminating Farmer Fred's house of horrors. I turned to my best friend. He lived only a few minutes' walk from Farmer Fred's, and the last 3 Halloweens I had gone trick-or-treating in his neighborhood and spent the night at his house. Jimmy was a tough kid, afraid of nothing. He was the kid on the football team that would literally run through a wall if the coaches told him to. Before the concussion craze, Jimmy would damn near knock himself out every game we played, plowing through our opponents, leading with his head. I knew there was only one option for him when it came to the rite of passage, and he would make sure everyone knew it. "I'm going with the jack-o'-lantern. I think that's the safest bet," I whispered, making sure none of the other guys could hear me. "I'm going for the scarecrow," Jimmy exclaimed, making sure the entire group heard him. "Bullshit. You don't have the balls, Jim. I bet you $5 you chicken out and whip a rock like the rest of us," said one of our teammates. Jim flashed me a half smile, relishing the attention of the other guys. "Oh, you're on, buddy," Jim snickered at his doubter. Jim turned to me, grinning like an idiot. "Easiest $5 I'll ever make," he said smugly. Next, his doubter, a kid named Greg Spinelli, brushed his greasy black hair out of his eyes and turned his sights on me. He knew I was low-hanging fruit, and could likely sense my extreme anxiety over the whole situation. "What about you, Mendez? You gonna join your buddy, or will you tell me you Mexi can't do it?" He and his buddies roared with laughter. "I'm Puerto Rican, dick," I growled at him in anger. "Screw you, Greg," Jimmy interjected. "You're just pissed Oscar stole your job on defense." I was thankful for Jim. Even though he was an arrogant, pompous, loud-mouthed, cocky bastard, he was a damn good friend. For a brief moment I had forgotten that we were quickly approaching Farmer Fred's. As we cut through an overgrown rhododendron, the house appeared, as nightmarish as ever. There was already a small array of jack-o'-lanterns and uncarved pumpkins on the decrepit old porch, offerings from some of the superstitious football players who had the foresight not to wait until Halloween to complete their ritual. I envied those kids. Slowly but surely we trounced through the overgrown thickets in front of the farmhouse, and were standing no more than 20 yards from the front porch. I could feel the sweat beginning to pool between my shoulders. My heart began to thump heavily in my chest. I had no idea how I was going to muster the courage to go up there. The group stopped and Greg stepped out in front, the sun nearly gone now, his shadow silhouetted on the house behind him as the last of the light faded away. "All right then," he said. "Who wants the honors?" My teammates and I looked around at each other, no one willing to be the first, no one except Jimmy, that is. He stepped forward, head held high, like a knight of old stepping forward to slay a dragon. "What will it be, Jimmy?" Greg asked. "An offering or a tempting of fate?" Jimmy stared him down for a moment. Though only a few seconds, it seemed like an eternity. I held my breath, knowing what he was going to pick, but the anticipation of it was killing me. He looked around the group, making sure to lock eyes with each of his teammates, really savoring the attention. He turned back and pointed to the scarecrow waving in the breeze, almost beckoning us in. "I think it's been too long since our friend down there has had some company. I think I'll change that this year." Our group erupted with cheers, all but Greg, that is, who looked on in disgust. His chagrin at Jimmy's popularity with the team was evident. At that very moment, my dad's voice could be heard calling from the parking lot above. "Oscar, let's go. We have to pick up your sister." Everyone turned from Jimmy and looked at me. I knew what they were all thinking. He's not going to do it. He's going to cop out. What a wussy. Growing up when I did, toxic masculinity wasn't quite the taboo it has become, and the only thing I could think of worse than being ripped apart by the ghost of Farmer Fred was being called a coward by the entire football team. For a 13-year-old boy, that would have been a fate worse than death. I was in a tough spot, but as if by divine intervention, Jimmy once again came to my rescue. I know you were all looking for a show tonight, but those of you with actual balls will be here tomorrow night after trick-or-treating. Oscar told me that he wanted to place his pumpkin up there on the most terrifying night of the year. Isn't that right, Oz? He looked at me and winked. Yeah, absolutely, I stumbled over the words. Just figured we only get one 8th grade ritual. Should probably make it count, right? Jimmy was a genius. I had never thought about completing the ritual on Halloween. It was a gamble, but it was almost assured that none of the other guys would even show up, either out of terror of the idea of doing it on the anniversary of Fred's death, or the fear of missing out on all that Halloween has to offer a 13-year-old boy. Either way, it was almost a guarantee that I wouldn't actually have to do anything but show up and say that I did the ritual. Worst case scenario, I would have to place my pumpkin on the porch the following night, but at least I would have Jimmy there, and I would gain some clout with the guys for completing the deed on Halloween night. I turned to walk up the hillside and meet my dad, a little more confident and extremely relieved. Catch you tomorrow, Oz, Jimmy yelled as I climbed back through the rhododendron. Keep an eye out for a good jack-o'-lantern. You'll need it. After a sleepless night, Halloween morning arrived, and I was soon filled with dread. It was actually disconcerting the level of fear I was feeling that morning, knowing that I would possibly be completing the ritual. In all my years, not before and not since have I ever felt dread like that, to the point where it literally weighed me down. As evening approached, I tried to set my mind to trick-or-treating, hanging out with my best friend, and possibly meeting up with the girls that we were both talking to. For a 13-year-old boy chock full of hormones, it's amazing that I could think of anything outside my romantic interest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly being drawn into something horrible. The prospect of talking to a girl I was into seemed like such an easy task compared to the daunting feat of putting a jack-o'-lantern on Farmer Fred's porch. As evening drew closer, I could barely eat. My mom had to remind me to get my costume on, and she could tell something was off. Are you sure you want to go to Jimmy's tonight? You haven't really been yourself today, she said as she placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Yeah, Mom, I'm sure. It's tradition. I'll get changed at Jimmy's, though. I packed up my costume, a bright orange suit complete with top hat and cane. Jimmy had the matching suit in baby blue. Our favorite movie of all time was Dumb and Dumber, so the chance to be Harry and Lloyd for a night was too good to pass up. After a short drive that felt like an eternity, anxiety filled me to the point where I felt like I couldn't walk until we got to Jimmy's. It wasn't Jimmy's house that had relieved my anxiety, but his neighbors across the street. There, on the third step leading up to their porch, was a jack-o'-lantern, and carved into this pumpkin was a grim reaper. I'm not sure why, but I knew this was going to be what I used for my offering, and for some reason knowing that put me incredibly at ease. Perhaps it was how the candle light glowed softly behind the silhouette, but I became indifferent to my fears and allowed myself to enjoy the evening. I was astonished at how much fun I had trick-or-treating that night, and shocked at how at ease I was with the idea of completing the ritual. After we finished trick-or-treating, we returned to Jimmy's house to change, before heading back out to Farmer Fred's. Did you find a good pumpkin? Jimmy asked as we snuck out his basement door. I think so, yeah, I said as I sneakily jogged up his driveway, beckoning him to follow behind. We stood, hidden in the bushes across from his neighbor's house, and I pointed across the street. When he saw the pumpkin I had chosen, he nodded in agreement, and we moved across the street as quietly as we could. We made sure there wasn't anyone around, and I snuck onto the porch to snag the jack-o'-lantern. My heart began to race, more from excitement than anything else. I crept across the wooden porch, trying not to make any noise. When I got to the jack-o'-lantern, I carefully corralled it in my arms and dashed off into the night, Jimmy following just behind. We chatted as we made our way through the massive rhododendron and onto the property of Farmer Fred. Up until this point, I had been feeling pretty good about the whole thing and was starting to think that even if no one else showed up, I was going to complete the ritual and place my jack-o'-lantern with the others. Jimmy and I stood on the hillside just above Farmer Fred's, peering down at the slowly rotting house that hadn't been properly lived in for almost half a century. Though it was a cloudy night, The crescent moon shone bright, directly on Jimmy's foe, the scarecrow. "Well, Oz, looks like you lucked out. No one else showed." I swallowed hard and relit the candle in my jack-o'-lantern. It shone through, acting almost as a flashlight, guiding my path down to the rickety old porch and a dozen other offerings. "I'm still doing it, Jim. I have to," I told him, my confidence waning a bit and anxiety slowly creeping in. "Hell, yeah. I'm proud of you, buddy," he said through a massive smile. As I walked down to complete the task, Jimmy made his way over to the scarecrow. I took a few steps onto the deck and glanced up at Jim, now standing directly in front of his adversary, pocket knife out, preparing to cut off a piece of the flannel shirt that wrapped the bony figure. I took a deep breath and held it as I placed my jack-o'-lantern next to the others. Just as I stood up, I heard a noise coming from behind me, coming from inside the house. Again my heart began to pound in my chest, but this time it was racing from pure, unadulterated fear. I turned slowly to peer into the house, beyond the front door, barely hanging onto the frame, and just as I thought I could make out a figure just beyond the hallway, lurking in the darkness, I felt a powerful blow to the back of my head. As I regained my composure and reached for my throbbing head, I looked up from the porch to see Greg, in full Superman costume, smashing the other pumpkin offerings. My Grim Reaper jack-o'-lantern had rolled through the doorway, and somehow had remained lit. It was now watching me from inside Farmer Fred's. As I tried to get back to my feet, Greg pushed me down, continuing to destroy the other offerings. "Greg, what the hell are you doing?" I said groggily. By this point, Jimmy was running at a full sprint from the scarecrow towards Greg, lowering his head ready to spear him through a wall. I tried to warn him, to tell him to stop, but it was too late. He had put his forehead square in Greg's back, wrapping his arms around him tight, driving his feet all the way through Farmer Fred's front door, knocking it completely off the hinges. I regained my footing and peered into the house to see Jimmy throttling Greg in the hallway next to the main stairwell. Behind the flurry of fists, seemingly unnoticed by Jimmy and Greg, was someone I had never seen before, but recognized immediately. There, standing in the hallway, noose still wrapped firmly around his neck, was the spectral image of Farmer Fred. He glowed with a soft white light, and was slightly opaque, but his eyes were fierce and red. I stood there stunned that Jimmy and Greg failed to notice the ghost who had cursed this property. "Yeah, absolutely," I stumbled over the words. "Just figured we only get one 8th grade ritual. Should probably make it count, right?" Jimmy was a genius. I had never thought about completing the ritual on Halloween. It was a gamble, but it was almost assured that none of the other guys would even show up, either out of terror of the idea of doing it on the anniversary of Fred's death, or the fear of missing out on all that Halloween has to offer a 13-year-old boy. Either way, it was almost a guarantee that I wouldn't actually have to do anything but show up and say that I did the ritual. Worst case scenario, I would have to place my pumpkin on the porch the following night, but at least I would have Jimmy there, and I would gain some clout with the guys for completing the deed on Halloween night. I turned to walk up the hillside and meet my dad, a little more confident and extremely relieved. "Catch you tomorrow, Oz," Jimmy yelled as I climbed back through the rhododendron. "Keep an eye out for a good jack-o'-lantern. You'll need it." After a sleepless night, Halloween morning arrived, and I was soon filled with dread. It was actually disconcerting the level of fear I was feeling that morning, knowing that I would possibly be completing the ritual. In all my years, not before and not since have I ever felt dread like that, to the point where it literally weighed me down. As evening approached, I tried to set my mind to trick-or-treating, hanging out with my best friend, and possibly meeting up with the girls that we were both talking to. For a 13-year-old boy chock full of hormones, it's amazing that I could think of anything outside my romantic interest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly being drawn into something horrible. The prospect of talking to a girl I was into seemed like such an easy task compared to the daunting feat of putting a jack-o'-lantern on Farmer Fred's porch. As evening drew closer, I could barely eat. My mom had to remind me to get my costume on, and she could tell something was off. "Are you sure you want to go to Jimmy's tonight? You haven't really been yourself today," she said as she placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Yeah, Mom, I'm sure. It's tradition. I'll get changed at Jimmy's, though." I packed up my costume, a bright orange suit complete with top hat and cane. Jimmy had the matching suit in baby blue. Our favorite movie of all time was Dumb and Dumber, so the chance to be Harry and Lloyd for a night was too good to pass up. After a short drive that felt like an eternity, Anxiety filled me to the point where I felt like I couldn't walk, until we got to Jimmy's. It wasn't Jimmy's house that had relieved my anxiety, but his neighbors across the street. There, on the third step leading up to their porch, was a jack-o'-lantern, and carved into this pumpkin was a grim reaper. I'm not sure why, but I knew this was going to be what I used for my offering, and for some reason knowing that put me incredibly at ease. Perhaps it was how the candle light glowed softly behind the silhouette, but I became indifferent to my fears and allowed myself to enjoy the evening. I was astonished at how much fun I had trick-or-treating that night, and shocked at how at ease I was with the idea of completing the ritual. After we finished trick-or-treating, we returned to Jimmy's house to change, before heading back out to Farmer Fred's. "Did you find a good pumpkin?" Jimmy asked as we snuck out his basement door. "I think so, yeah," I said as I sneakily jogged up his driveway, beckoning him to follow behind. We stood, hidden in the bushes across from his neighbor's house, and I pointed across the street. When he saw the pumpkin I had chosen, he nodded in agreement, and we moved across the street as quietly as we could. We made sure there wasn't anyone around, and I snuck onto the porch to snag the jack-o'-lantern. My heart began to race, more from excitement than anything else. I crept across the wooden porch, trying not to make any noise. When I got to the jack-o'-lantern, I carefully corralled it in my arms and dashed off into the night, Jimmy following just behind. We chatted as we made our way through the massive rhododendron and onto the property of Farmer Fred. Up until this point, I had been feeling pretty good about the whole thing and was starting to think that even if no one else showed up, I was going to complete the ritual and place my jack-o'-lantern with the others. Jimmy and I stood on the hillside just above Farmer Fred's, peering down at the slowly rotting house that hadn't been properly lived in for almost half a century. Though it was a cloudy night, the crescent moon shone bright, directly on Jimmy's foe, the scarecrow. "Well, Oz, looks like you lucked out." No one else showed. I swallowed hard and relit the candle in my jack-o'-lantern. It shone through, acting almost as a flashlight, guiding my path down to the rickety old porch and a dozen other offerings. "I'm still doing it, Jim. I have to," I told him, my confidence waning a bit and anxiety slowly creeping in. "Hell, yeah. I'm proud of you, buddy," he said through a massive smile. As I walked down to complete the task, Jimmy made his way over to the scarecrow. I took a few steps onto the deck and glanced up at Jim, now standing directly in front of his adversary, pocket knife out, preparing to cut off a piece of the flannel shirt that wrapped the bony figure. I took a deep breath and held it as I placed my jack-o'-lantern next to the others. Just as I stood up, I heard a noise coming from behind me, coming from inside the house. Again my heart began to pound in my chest, but this time it was racing from pure, unadulterated fear. I turned slowly to peer into the house, beyond the front door, barely hanging onto the frame, and just as I thought I could make out a figure just beyond the hallway, lurking in the darkness, I felt a powerful blow to the back of my head. As I regained my composure and reached for my throbbing head, I looked up from the porch to see Greg, in full Superman costume, smashing the other pumpkin offerings. My Grim Reaper jack-o'-lantern had rolled through the doorway, and somehow had remained lit. It was now watching me from inside Farmer Fred's. As I tried to get back to my feet, Greg pushed me down, continuing to destroy the other offerings. "Greg, what the hell are you doing?" I said groggily. By this point, Jimmy was running at a full sprint from the scarecrow towards Greg, lowering his head ready to spear him through a wall. I tried to warn him, to tell him to stop, but it was too late. He had put his forehead square in Greg's back, wrapping his arms around him tight, driving his feet all the way through Farmer Fred's front door, knocking it completely off the hinges. I regained my footing and peered into the house to see Jimmy throttling Greg in the hallway next to the main stairwell. Behind the flurry of fists, seemingly unnoticed by Jimmy and Greg, was someone I had never seen before, but recognized immediately. There, standing in the hallway, noose still wrapped firmly around his neck, was the spectral image of Farmer Fred. He glowed with a soft white light, and was slightly opaque, but his eyes were fierce and red. I stood there stunned that Jimmy and Greg failed to notice the ghost who had cursed this property. All I could do was stare in disbelief as the specter raised a hand and pointed at me. "Get out!" His raspy voice hissed in my ears, yet Jimmy and Greg continued to go at it. I was frozen with fear, but slowly started backing out onto the porch. Again the spirit pointed, but this time to my jack-o'-lantern which lay intact by my feet. He raised his blood-red eyes to mine, and again I could hear his voice inside my head whispering, "Get out or die." At this my pace quickened, and I tried to call out to Jimmy, but again the spirit spoke, and this time his voice boomed through the entire house. He pointed shakily to the scarecrow out front and roared, "Rise! Rise up and reap my vengeance!" Jimmy and Greg froze, Greg still underneath Jimmy fending off blows, but as they both realized the very real horror that was playing out just behind them, the true terror began to move outside. Following the command of Farmer Fred, the scarecrow stirred with an unnatural twitch, its rail-like limbs jerking in short bursts. Its crude sack of a head tilted awkwardly to one side, its neck creaking like a rusty old gate. For just a moment it was still, then it lurched toward us, arms hanging stiff at first, then rising slowly to reveal two gleaming hand scythes. It had set its sights on Jimmy and Greg, and where before there had been just dark sockets, now glowed two bright red eyes, matching those of Farmer Fred. Each step was disjointed, its arms stiff and legs dragged in the dirt with slow, grueling motions, struggling to maintain its balance. The scarecrow's knees buckled inward and its torso swayed, collapsing forward before jerking upright. It began to move with renewed purpose, gaining speed and flashing the two implements of death in its hands. The scarecrow blew right past me as it buried the first scythe directly below Greg's collarbone. Jimmy looked on in terror as blood fountained from Greg's chest, covering Jimmy in a stream of crimson. The ghost of Farmer Fred stood at the end of the hall, watching with delight as the scarecrow raised its other scythe, bringing it down with immense force into Jimmy's back. He and Greg both screamed in agony as the spirit beckoned to his minion. "Bring them to me," Fred ordered. The scarecrow grabbed the scythes and began dragging them down the hall. As it made its way toward the basement stairs, a large hole opened up in the wooden floor, surrounded by splintered boards that looked like jagged wooden teeth surrounding a sinister dark mouth. As the scarecrow slowly pulled Jimmy and Greg toward the abyss, Jimmy called out, "Oscar, help me. I couldn't move." My best friend was literally being dragged to hell, and I stood there frozen in fear. I hesitated for a moment as I tried to summon the courage to act, ultimately deciding I had to do something. I ran through the doorway and down the hall, each step sending crackles of fractured wood thundering through the house. Just as the scarecrow vanished into the floor, dragging my two teammates behind it, I reached out and caught a hold of Jimmy's hand. Stretched out across the floor, I held on as tightly as I could, elbow deep into the void. I could see into the crevice. Greg had been filleted by the outstretched boards, muscle and flesh torn from bone. He lay on the basement floor, a mess of blood and pulp. One of the boards had lodged itself in Jimmy's sternum, and I could feel the life slipping away from him. "Hold on, Jim. I've got you, buddy." Blood began to pool in his mouth, pouring from the side of his lips. The color was fading from his face, and he looked at me, knowing the end was near. He gurgled and tried to speak. "Oscar, it's not," he stuttered, "why you're default." Tears were streaming down my face, and again I heard the voice of Farmer Fred boom, "Bring him to me." As I held on to Jimmy, I felt him being ripped away from me, dragged into the depths of the house. I peered over the edge to see the bodies of my best friend and my worst enemy, side by side, ravaged in a way I can't even describe. Between them glowed the spirit of Farmer Fred, staring at me with those blood-red eyes. I got to my feet and ran, faster than I have ever ran in my life. I didn't stop running until I arrived at the Berkeley Hills Fire Company. There I told them what had happened, every gruesome detail. They didn't want to believe me at first, but I insisted they go back. As firefighters, they had been exposed to numerous pranks and jokes, but as locals themselves, they grew up with the legend as well, and none of them wanted to go investigate the claim. After a while, they made a call to the Ross Township Police, also assuming a prank, until they sent a squad car to check it out, confirming at least part of my story about two dead teenagers ripped to pieces in Farmer Fred's basement. I had to give a statement to the police, who naturally thought I was crazy. They presumed that Jimmy and Greg must have been fighting in the house and fallen through the floor. At least that became the official story. Before my mom picked me up that night, one of the younger officers pulled me aside. "Hey kid, did you really see Farmer Fred?" I looked at him, giddy with excitement, and gave him a cold answer that turned his smile into a sullen look of guilt. "As clear as I see you now," I said. "Damn kid, I remember my ritual years. I went with the broken window." Not long after that, Jimmy's grief-stricken mother burned down Farmer Fred's house, with herself inside. The lot has since become overgrown, but the bones of the house remain. Maybe I'm a bit superstitious about what will happen if I do nothing, but every year on Halloween I return to the house and place a jack-o'-lantern on the ruins. It's an offering to the spirit that haunts the grounds, but also a memorial to those who were lost there, and whose spirits may not be at rest. Story number 4. It happened not too long ago. I remember the hysteria that was developing when we first got word of what it would be. One of the largest hurricanes of all time. It wasn't developing in the southern end near Florida. In the reports leading up to it, everyone remembers recording all of the storms coming towards the northern point of the eastern coast. Some even said that New York would be many feet in water. Droves and droves of people started to move out of the Big Apple, fearing that everything they had would be lost forever. For once in my life, I was very scared for such a large amount of people who were going to feel the wrath of Mother Nature. The news called it the ending hurricane, but the World Meteorological Organization named it Hurricane John. A lousy name for such a movement. I, like so many people, reached out to family and relatives on that coast. I was ushering them to get out as soon as possible to outrun the impending doom. Many listened, but friends doing the same couldn't get their families to move or budge. I kept pushing and prodding, wondering why they would stay, but they couldn't even get an answer out of their own family. Everyone remembers watching the footage from the news of the traffic leaving the city, and anywhere near it. The footage that I saw of the churning storm several hundred miles off of the coast moving forward, inching to the demise of such a historic city. Its darkness was shrouded by the speed of the winds and the water covering that hurricane, which kept it like a cloud of death. Then one day, it all stopped. Not the storm that kept spinning and spinning, but stopped 800 miles off the coast. A bird watching its prey not far away, but watching nonetheless, knowing it can swallow it in a second, but not quite hungry enough yet. The storms inside of the hurricane got bigger, the thunder got louder, and the lightning strikes got hotter. Meteorologists suggested that the inside of the storm was heating up to over 400 degrees due to the sheer pressure that was cooking inside and not having a chance to escape. The winds were so brutal that every opportunity these companies would try to penetrate through them was thwarted without even touching the outer rim of the hurricane. I started to think about what it would be like to find myself inside of that. How would your skin start to peel and then rip off due to the wind and heat? Maybe it would take a few seconds, maybe a minute. Either way, it wouldn't be too long. Even though the storm halted and wasn't moving toward the city again, no one was going back. People from Florida were now speaking of reports of being able to see it from the southern state, that it darkened the sky even for them. Life went on, and so did the storm. It went on and on for nearly a month, lurking in the heart of the Atlantic Ocean, between Europe and America, waiting to pounce. My family in North Carolina was even starting to get worried about it. It was talked about like the first time it had ever happened, a hurricane that doesn't seem to end and doesn't seem to move. One morning, the storm was gone. Newscasts went out in helicopters to get more film of it, and it was gone. But something was in its place. I remember seeing the articles, the questions, and the theories all start to pop up. Where the storm once was, now stands a pale mountain. It was not any type of mountain, but an extremely slim one, with its width growing as it got closer to the sea, then slimming back again at the very bottom. The mountain also stood at the time, which the news thought was nearly 33,000 feet tall, casting a shadow over the world. It bolstered through the clouds, standing against the heavy waves that lapped up against its side. Seeing those videos now just sends shivers down my spine. Looking at this thing that made no sense, defied everything that happened in this life. How did it get here? How was it formed in a storm? Was it the heat mixing with moisture? Maybe it created a sort of tectonic plate shift that happened overnight? How were there now major tsunamis or waves that rippled from beneath the sea? All of my buddies started contemplating this anomaly, and we then began to send each other links one after another after another. From ancient civilizations that left our planet coming back, it could be a peace offering from another galactic force that now knows about us, or a warning message from one. Some even started to think that the hell below the ocean opened up and started pushing this through. It didn't take long for the United States military to start harboring near the mountain, and several of our aircraft carriers started to sail toward it. Russia, China, and other world powers started to do the same. It was as if it were the human front to stand guard against this thing. The newscasts showed these massive ships cut through the waves making their way towards the thing, all looking like ants compared to this thing. Life started to move forward. People started to accept that this thing was here, and it was not moving, stationary as the hurricane was before it. Even though it was on the back of everyone's minds, it was best not to bring it up. It was the world's open secret, something that we couldn't run from, something that towered over us. No one knew its origin, and it could be a million years before we found out what it was. I had called my brother. We grew estranged way back, just to hear his words on the issue. He lived a much more conservative lifestyle than I. He was a religious man. His ideas on it were not clarified, nor did they bring my more rational thinking approach to a calm. He told me that that's life. It's here and we have to deal with it. I asked about his thoughts of a higher power now, but he had no response that made me feel better. It hasn't changed. I told him thanks, hanging up on him before he could say anything. No one had an answer, and that was completely why I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think of anything else. This massive eyesore was stuck in my mind like it was stuck in the Atlantic, and no one wanted to talk about it. I couldn't sleep, I barely could eat, and I was losing myself and watching the news 24/7 trying to get answers. But the news stopped talking about it. Eyes must have left the station once they brought it up, but how? How could anyone turn off the television when that thing was staring at them from the screen? I needed an update on this thing, and I needed it at that moment. My persistent looking and digging brought me to a live stream that was watching it. Day and night a camera was watching this thing from afar. But it was better than nothing. I needed to have power over it like it had power over me. I needed to know when it would do anything, if it would shift, if it would change, if it would start walking. I needed to be the first one to know. I would watch day and night for 3 days straight, not a ounce of will left in my body other than to watch this thing. Watch what its next move was and how it was going to execute it. Then it happened. My red-stained eyes saw it, but barely. At this point, I must have seen double. But something was dropping off of this thing. Large rocks that were starting to fall from the top of it and would knock down more and more. They came crashing into the ocean with splashes that jumped up into the sky. I launched out of my bed and called everyone that I knew. I told them to turn into the channel. I started to freak out. The pieces just wouldn't stop falling. The carriers even started to float away out of the fallen debris. Small chunks, big chunks, all falling over and over, as if the sky was chipping away at this anomaly. Everyone started to think about what was going to be underneath this shroud, what was inside of the rock that was starting to come out. What monstrous entity is going to crawl out of this mountain, coming out of its depths to come to an end all of humanity? My glasses hung off the bridge of my nose as I was staring at these chunks landing into the abyss. I then got a text from my friend. It said, "Do you see it?" I pushed my glasses up to my face and waited for my eyes to adjust. I blinked and blinked, the fogginess starting to making out details, until I did see it. The pieces falling from the head of the mountain were by design, because what it started to look like was a face. A nose, cheekbones, and some slits for eyes and a mouth were appearing. I texted back, "Am I crazy or is that a face?" "You are not crazy. That thing has a carved face," he replied. The chunks kept falling from the height and more was being seen. It started trending. The news picked it up. The open secret of the world that everyone tried to forget about for so long was declaring all of its residents' eyes again. The show was not yet over. More and more fell, and more was detailed. The face became more feminine. The top and downward were looking more and more like a veil on her head, draping down onto her arms. Then, without any more, the pieces stopped. Her gaze fell upon the world, and ours went up to her. For a moment it felt like the whole world stopped and just had to breathe a collected breath. One that we wouldn't forget. From that day forward everything changed. I still wish that she had never come here. Whatever she was and whatever sent her to be a message of gentleness or a gift, or a harbinger of evils beyond our comprehension. Many saw it as something else. Because I have talked to so many people, and so many of those friends and strangers have their own thoughts on this thing. What's the point? What's our purpose? Everyone had a different story or rabbit hole we went down. But one thing stayed consistent no matter what. When you looked at this entity, it always looked like it was staring right at you. Paranoia started routing and moving through the media and minor simpletons like myself. It seemed as if everyone was lost in the clutch of this being's palm, not strong enough to break through her grasp, just all of our souls trapped inside with no one to help. I started to get concerned. I started reading more and more to try to understand anything. History often repeats itself, and for once in my life I was on my own trying to connect the dots of our past to now. But through my scrounging, I hit more dead ends than I wanted to. I got obsessed with this presence so much that I lost my job. So, many people lost their jobs, but it's not a big deal. I then moved over to New York, working part-time here and there. The mass exodus caused a plummet of rent, so it wasn't hard to find a place. The streets were empty. For a town that I had never been to, all I had heard was that it was a bustling city, and the city that never sleeps, but I found that the city was quiet, soulless, and a skeleton of an old king that now lays in its final resting place. I got a spot not far off the Atlantic coast, a small apartment with 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and 1 closet, small enough for only a few jackets to fit in. It was undersized. Maybe some would consider it tiny, but it was adequate. There was really 1 window that gazed out towards her, and through my small window I saw it well off the coast. Not particulars, but her silhouette. Today I could only see it up to her chest, then the rest were lost in the clouds, rising up and up. That week I started to take notes on the woman. I was trying to see what it would do. Will it move one day, or will it shift just slightly, trying to figure out if we even noticed? Can she see us? What was causing it to mold into a woman? Day after day, note after note, I kept writing and writing. I had the news on behind me, while I used a newly acquired old telescope, trying to see when the next chip would happen. The news coverage started to talk about what was happening in Europe, off the western coast of England. There was a video that night of a group of maybe 200 or more people. They were all in darkened cloaks, with a veil over their faces. They stood on the shore, all in a line, shoulder to shoulder with one another. They all stared at the woman. The woman probably stared back. I got lost in the video. I took my eyes off her, staring at the screen. My eyes were probably reddened at this point. I watched these people all standing with the small waves washing at their feet. The man filming them is just as confused as everyone at home. They all took a step, and then another and another. They stepped in unison all into the ocean, their wall proving stronger than the waves coming at them. They kept walking past knee-deep, then chest, then to their neck. None of them lost a step, in a complete straight line, until all of them converged with the water. The only thing left was the lapping waves of the ocean, and beyond that her horrifying darkened silhouette in the distance. I could only stare, unlike the person filming whose audio was bleeped out every other word by the coverage. I waited and waited for them to rise back up. But nothing broke the surface, not even their veils. I slowly turned back towards the woman, aghast at what I had just witnessed, and noticed that more chippings were falling off of her. It took no more than 2 hours as I watched large pieces fall from the waist area, all plummeting down into the sea, followed by smaller ones as they started to show her slightly outstretched arms. Her long sleeves draped as far below as her knees. Her hands started to get defined, her fingers split in between, and her fingernails accented. She was starting to look remarkable, her face to me now taunting, not a smile but a slightly unexpressed face. One that sullen all witnesses. One that immediately made me step away from my scope and turn off the news when it hit HD on my small screen. Why was this thing here? Were ancient beings watching when America received the statue from France and found it to be endearing? Was this an olive branch and they wanted one in return? What was the point? That night I hadn't slept a wink. I lost my part-time job due to not showing up. I realized what my calling was. It was to be the ultimate witness for her. To write a book about this whole endeavor, for people 1,000 years from now to understand the situation, how it played out, and what the result was for. I understand it all now. This was my calling. That night I went for a walk to clear my head and to debrief before I went headfirst into this path. I was weighing my options and needed to get some fresh air. Madison Avenue used to be a busy street from what I've been told, but tonight it was completely different, empty and weightless. I could scream and only hear my voice bounce off of the buildings, rising higher and higher to escape. I passed some graffiti, which must have been new, and must have been quick. It was large, taking up a sizable chunk of the wall. All it read in solid red letters was, "Why did she stop looking at me?" I turned up my collar and continued walking, All I could think about was what this person meant and how they felt. Did they feel relief or grief? I wouldn't know she still saw me. That night I had my first episode. I fell asleep staring at her through my window. In the ease of my sleep, I found myself lost in the ocean, under the waves kicking up yet never reaching that break. I wasn't drowning yet, but I wasn't able to move up. In fact, it felt like I was getting slightly dragged down. Then all of a sudden, the waves crashing above me stopped, and everything started to calm. The waters all leveled out and I could see the night sky above. A calmness overtook me as I stopped kicking for a moment. But then the night sky was overtaken by a large grayness. As she stood over me, the moon crescenting around her head as she looked down at me. A pure horror and dread entered my soul, and for the first time, I tried swimming down. But now I couldn't move at all. I turned back to her. I screamed. Her face was resting right above the water break, staring at me, her nose an inch above the sea. Her hand entered, splashing mountainous waves through and through as it swung to come to get me. I woke up in a pool of sweat, clutching my shirt, which became another layer of skin in the night. Soon after, I believe that it was a Tuesday when the first reports came in from Pakistan. A man walked into a rundown mall in the center of Islamabad in a jacket. He walked into a store, I do not recall which one, and took his jacket off. Underneath it was a vest, in his hand a remote. 13 people lost their lives that afternoon. People that knew him said he was completely enveloped by the woman, and thought it was a mockery sent from hell itself, that if no one tried to shake the grasp that she had on the world, then sooner or later she would pull every last one of us back down to her resting hole. I guess his idea was to kill himself and others in a showing to maybe take eyes off of her. It didn't. Copycats and other people who were mentally unhinged started to do mass executions, people burning themselves alive. All of it caught on video and spread throughout the world on social media. One video that I saw was a man in the middle of a city, I believe Dallas. He wore a white shirt and in horrible calligraphy said, "She isn't real. None of it is." He screamed to gain more viewers, watchers, and fellow beings before he pulled a pistol out and shot himself under the jaw and through his brain. Screams followed as people ran, but he lay there and the person filming stayed holding it on his body. His still shaking body on the concrete. He was still alive. At this time, the countries surrounding the woman with their platoons and fleets started to back away. China accused America of propaganda and conspiracized that we came up with this as a means to create a global scare. We started to say the same thing about China. The ships stopped aiming their guns at the woman and started aiming them at each other. The doomsday clock was at 11 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. The world was knocking on the nuclear response's door waiting for them to answer. Germany, Poland, and Israel all started choosing sides and started demanding vocal support from other nations. Tensions were rising and global policies were wearing thin. It was a sense of desperation that people were feeling, and you could sense it by having everyday interactions. People were starting to stock up on food, buy firearms, and even reinforce valuables. My brother started to reach out to me. I realized that I didn't think he knew that I moved. I was going to call him, but then my phone opened up to a random video. It was at this time that Mary Del Costa came onto everyone's page. If it was through different means of social media, or whatever avenue you saw her. Her first video was a hit. It was a 20-second video and it was titled, "I Am Her." She was draped in a long light blue robe, her face with a slight smirk. She stood just how the woman stood. She stood like that for the whole video, a light illuminating from behind her until the video cut out. It wasn't even a few days when she posted again. What was once a video of her all alone, now she was standing in front of a congregation of 20 or more people. Same premise, and the same result, but it was a little longer. The people were all on their knees in front of her, and you could see some of them were crying, not out of a sense of fear or hurt, but a way of love and hope. I saw right through it. This horrible woman was using this life-altering event to cash in and to start a weird faux religious experience. She was all that was wrong with the world right now. I had to dedicate a whole chapter of my book to her and her alone because of what she was doing and how it was evil and lured people looking desperately for answers into her fictitious and malevolent web. All while everything was becoming crazier outside. You couldn't travel a channel or web page without seeing the warning headlines, or a person speaking in their native tongue about the horrors that people were doing to one another. Bombings, shootings, lootings, arson, and overall anarchy became the new tenets. Neighbors became new people with the same faces. The smell of burned rubber, gas, and other aromas often crept underneath my closed windows, reminding me of the rest of the city. I didn't care for this mnemonic the city often sent me. All I know is if I was smelling it all, then I think she was too. The paper the next day read of a new disease that was spreading through many countries. It was greatly affecting only young children and the elderly. It was so early on that doctors didn't know how to describe it, how it spread, or its origins. The only thing that they could gather was that it didn't strike anywhere except brain function and the respiratory area. After visiting with some of the first couple thousand victims, it was determined that their lungs were not exchanging the proper amount of oxygen intake and carbon dioxide release, that they were holding onto their carbon dioxide. This caused them to have slight symptoms, according to people near them, of light dizziness and drowsiness. They all died in their sleep. The World Health Organization called this disease Omega-1. A meeting was to be held in Washington. The president called on many nations to attend in an attempt to try to find something to ease tensions with our rivals. Several of our allies came, and many of our biggest enemies were now in our backyard. For a little bit, many cameras turned from her and onto the gods of government as they pulled up in our United Nations building. No press was allowed into said event, and many online started to worry that this was all a scheme, a ploy, this woman planted here by all that were in charge, a way to convince people to accept a new world order, that safety was only found through strength in numbers. The meeting lasted hours. When everyone departed, all who were herded inside had faces of the lost. Reports came out of Rome, and videos too. A mass movement as many Catholics gathered in and around the Vatican, all holding candles as they walked towards their holy land. Priests, men, women, and children. A large crowd, yet all of them standing and in complete and utter silence. I wanted to call my brother to see what he thought about the whole event, but it didn't matter. I sent him a text instead, only asking, "What do you think of it all?" Very quickly he sent me back a text telling me to pray. I never was like him. I was a scientific man, reason over faith. But to each is their own. I just stared at her body through my window. Through that window I began noticing all of the backed-off military ships were slowly moving closer to her. While they moved closer to her, the clouds around her head started to swirl too. A storm was encroaching around her again. From my telescope it was a beautiful sight watching the man-made machines and the weather-made spectacle all move in on her. The world was hers once again. The storm started to pick up speed, swirling and swirling. I wasn't able to see her anymore as the day started to die. The storm was perfectly encapsulating her, a cup of horror contained by her proximity. The ships all placed their bright spotlights onto the storm, helicopters and jets flying near it, tracking it for some reason. What was the point of that meeting? What was discussed? That was when the lightning started to strike in the storm. Bright lights, blue, white, and green struck, followed quickly by the strike of thunder. Barely heard by my apartment window, but must have blown the ears off of the personnel below it on those carriers. The light show went on for what seemed like hours, but could have been minutes. I never thought to check a clock or watch in case I missed something, my hand on my pencil etching words that probably made no sense while my eyes grew encrusted on the lens of my scope. The strikes became brighter. The horns became louder. That was when we saw it. Through the storm we could see her large silhouette. She seemed bigger in the shadows. More and more came. Then suddenly they stopped for a moment. Then the brightest of them came, and I could hear the screams from across the waters. The lightning sparked the hurricane's walls with the brightest blue, yet she changed. Her arms were now completely outstretched and her head hung to the right. I jumped back from my telescope, disoriented as my eyes tried to adjust to the change in depth. The thunder eclipsed the screams. As it went dark, I could see no more. The storm raged on, but no more lightning and no more thunder. I stared in awe. I was not able to see her anymore, but the visual was everlasting in my eyes. A pic placed into my brain hidden in the wrinkles, only for me to know where it was seated. I climbed into bed looking out to the sea and didn't sleep a wink, waiting for the storm to pass, so I could see her new structure. The storm passed in the early morning when the sun crossed the horizon and was cut in half by her. Yet her stance stayed the same as before, her arms hovering off of her sides near her waist. She didn't move an inch. Was it a trick of my own eyes? What the hell had happened last night? I didn't drink more than normal. The ships were still near her. As the day brightened, I noticed the departures of several aircraft taking off of the carriers. Every single one of them sent birds up to the skies, so fast that all you could catch was the exhaust trails in the air. Lost and confused, I turned on the channel, readying myself for the all-call. The horns lifted up in the air as to sound off for the fallout. But what I saw had me lost. There on a podium outside of the White House was the president. Well, many presidents. Standing shoulder to shoulder behind ours. He was talking about the woman and how since she has come here no good has happened. Fear ran amok, people didn't see people, and now the Omega virus has crept into over 74 countries with countless amount of victims. We must see this anomaly, this unprecedented and horrifying monument, as a harbinger of suffering. I stand here today aligned with many other great leaders and using our combined military strength to dispose of it quickly and efficiently. So that we can return to life again. That was when I heard the first missile hit. I spun from my television, launching myself towards my window and seeing the explosion off of her left side. Then more came. A storming of missiles and attacks from all points, earth, sea, and sky, all collectively attacking her. She stood tall. She stood strong. As more and more came at her, she didn't have any defense, no shield. They landed hit after hit after hit. She didn't bend or break underneath the fierce hand of man. I turned back to the news where they were covering her sabotage. I remember that the assault lasted an hour. Punch after punch landed on her. She never showed any sign of wear or tear. When the last missile landed, it was a direct hit on her face. The tiniest crack fell down. From the base of her eye it trickled just below her cheek. The militaries were most likely stunned, but needing to save some of their artillery, they decided that was enough for today. The attack ended at 9:54 a.m. She stood there afterwards, as the air went silent throughout the world. News stations didn't know what to say. The fleet of missiles and attacks barely fazed her. Nearly everything that we had. It was then noticed by all eastern cities and western cities in Europe that they would be sending nuclear attacks on her in the morning. We should all leave the city at once and expect not to return until all of the fallout is cleaned up. I was never going to leave. This was my story, and I would see it through until the end. That was when she eventually would fall. I messaged my brother my thoughts and explanations as to why I came to this conclusion. He tried getting me out. He tried calling. I answered, but he offered me to stay with him so that I could get back to a normal life. He passed over how his voice sounded. His voice full of sniffles. I asked him about it. He tried turning the conversation back onto me. That is usually how we end the calls. It was not a shouting match, but a game that was at a standstill. Neither of us was going to give ground. I was staying here, he would stay there. I remember drowning all the traffic sounds throughout the day. It would be a long night, one that might even cause my death, but this project was bigger than that. I remember tuning into a live stream of Mary Del Costa. She was praying over hundreds of people now, stating that she would be leaving soon from all of them, that they should repent. I almost threw up at the psyop she was pulling. Del Costa even means off the coast. Can these people not think for themselves? They were witnessing a miracle, and instead turned towards a failed actress. It enraged me to the bone. I drank and drank. Had my alarm set up to 6 a.m. when they collectively decided to send a flurry of nukes at her. I went to bed holding back tears, thinking of what might happen to her, to me, to the world itself. All answers will be revealed in just a few hours. Time was moving ahead as it always does. Everyone held their breath to try to stop it, but to no avail. It marched. I awoke to my alarm chanting in my ear. I arose, drowsy and half-blind. My eyes recalibrated as my vision aligned to the coast. My face would have melted if I had known emotion, but at that moment I forgot everything. The horizon was connected. The sun rose with nothing to cast a shadow. The clouds floated as one, nothing to cut it in half. She was gone. No storm to announce her departure, as she so grandly did to encapsulate her arrival. Nothing. Militaries who were watching her day and night had an answer to it. She was gone and no one knew how, why, or when. Not another missile was launched. The next few days I gathered all my thoughts, notes, photos, and everything that I had. I started to build my book. It took me a couple of months while still being cooped up in my small apartment nestled over my laptop. After I was done, it was all written up. I sent it to many publishers. Many sent it right back to me. Others took a while to get a message back. Over 30 publishers, and none of them took it. None of them wanted it. They kept telling me that it was insensitive to everyone who was lost due to the Omega virus. Nobody wanted to read about something that we all witnessed and that we all wanted to forget. That people just wanted to move on with their lives and never think of it again. I sat there reading these messages over and over again, with a printed 400-page manuscript and nowhere to send it. I was astounded. All my work, all my hibernation, all my purpose was to be forgotten in the wind with no one to care or want to read it. I became lost. I didn't know what to do. I started to take to the bottle more and more. Days blended into weeks, and weeks trickled and flowed to months. My brother became a victim of the virus soon after and softly departed us. His funeral didn't have many visitors. The world, like I, had become a shell of itself. I saw it through the screen and could hear it through my window. Something felt off, like it had become darker and sadder. Even some days felt worthless. Lawlessness started growing and taking over nations. Riots ran the streets. I started to drink a lot more. I couldn't even look out the window that I grew to only know, the one where I saw her, because there was no one to look back at me. The Times Person of the Year ended up being her. With the tagline, "Why did she come? Where did she go?" There was a dedicated slot for all that was lost to the sickness, millions upon millions. Seeing her on the cover told me one thing, though, that people did care, that people wanted to read up on her. Just that they didn't want to read it through me. All I could think of through this is how her leaving made me feel left behind. I always wondered who else felt the same way, but was always too afraid to ask anyone that I passed. I write this half-drunk to whoever will read it, as a summary of what I thought my life's work was, as I sit on the floor in my closet. Just a throwaway on a message board to be lost as soon as others write on top of it. I sit here in silence, the door closed. For the chance she does come back, there would be no way for her to see me and what I have become.